All right, everyone, the big day is finally here. Ebola has fully escaped containment and ended up in another country. The Ebola crisis that was just a crisis for the Congo, mainly related to civil war and a consecutive outbreak of malaria, actually, and the shortage of chloroquine or whatever they're using these days. Unfortunately, now it's in Uganda. So now you have a case, a homegrown case in another country. Well, isn't that just fucking wonderful? See, the problem is people were warning about that, but the legacy media and even a lot of independent commentators, they never took it seriously. They're like, oh, Ebola. Oh, well, nothing new under the sun. Oh, it's just Ebola. Don't worry about it too much. The thing is, there could have been a much more broad international response, but that would have required people actually knowing that there was an Ebola outbreak. The problem being, of course, most of the world remain blissfully unaware, other than those of you who watch my channel regularly. You probably know that there's an Ebola outbreak getting worse and worse in Central Africa, but the normies, until today, nope, they didn't know. Now it's a little bit late. You see, you've got thousands of cases. You've got hundreds of new active cases every week. It's mounting. There was a tripling of cases. 2 days ago, they mentioned the number of new cases had tripled. That's number one. Number two, now it's in another country. Number three, you've got escalating violence towards the care workers trying to contain the outbreak. You have attacks. You didn't have this in West Africa. I think there was one incident when there was an attack on an Ebola ward there. Here you've had 4 or 5 attacks on Ebola clinics and hospital workers inside of a couple of months. It's getting worse, not better. Doctors Without Borders is like, hey, we need more security. Then there were other people saying, no, you need to stop having troops around the Ebola workers because it intimidates people. You're fucked if you do and you're fucked if you don't. Yeah, it's going to intimidate people into not seeking treatment. But then it's also going to intimidate those healthcare workers into coming back into the Western world or at least fleeing off into the jungle when they realize, hey, we're going to come under mortar fire tomorrow. Hey, people are going to come and loot the ward because, hey, there are people around here who are chronically ill and starving. Well, they don't care. They're going to risk it. Oh, too bad there's Ebola fluids all over this room, but they want the medical equipment. They're going to sell it and they're going to eat well for a week before they die of Ebola. That's the way it works. I'm of the mind that they should have responded a lot quicker. I'm of the mind that the best thing that could be done is that the world needs to take tropical diseases more seriously. Some of these diseases are not still fully studied. They do not have an effective serum for Ebola. They've got a couple of experimental serums that show a little bit of promise. Instead of a 50% death rate, it's only 45% or something. Great, so, a handful of people are saved, assuming you can get the serum to them. You're talking about an area with dirt roads, covered in potholes, an area lacking infrastructure, which is racked by civil war, and constantly, even in the best of times, some village or small city in Central Africa, is it really stable? No. It's one gunshot away from a civil war. That's the problem with underdeveloped parts of the world, and the West gets involved. It's like Western involvement caused the problem a little bit anyway. Westerners come in, build a bunch of infrastructure, the population begins to explode, and then we're like, oh shit, nobody bothered to build a medical apparatus. Well, I guess we better send malaria nets over. I guess we better send chloroquine, because the good old quinine no longer works because malaria is evolving too. What happens when we run out of synthetic drugs? We're already beginning to hit that wall. What are you going to do? We can't even tackle the common cold. You think we can tackle Ebola? All you need is for it to mutate right now and become more infectious, and pretty soon 1 million people are dead. Maybe it goes world pandemic mode. Maybe the next time, unlike the West Africa outbreak that took us, trust me, we were a step from Armageddon. And they're never going to admit to this, but if you know anything about basic biology, we were one step from Armageddon. Ebola mutated. It became considerably more infectious, able to self-sustain. It was an unsustainable situation. There was no containment in the West African outbreak. A second mutation occurred and began inoculating people with an asymptomatic variety that made them resistant to actual Ebola, thus cutting off the host reservoir and stopping the outbreak. Now they're Ebola-free again. We got very, very lucky. In fact, the fact that Ebola appears mutation-prone probably saved us. What happens if this time that doesn't? What happens if this time Ebola mutates, like in West Africa, like we know that it can? It becomes more infectious, 2 or 3 times more infectious. It's more able to spread. It's more resistant, so the droplets, when people sneeze, they cough, they bleed, whatever, they stay around longer. Symptoms make it, it goes fully airborne or something. Something happens and it becomes through mutation, more able to transmit from person A to person B, or from person A to a group of persons B. Let's say that happens. Now let's say that it takes a year before an asymptomatic mutant arrives. Well, I mean, it could have gone across half the world by then. The problem is, if you have outbreaks at the same time because of world travel, those pools of people, the number of generations, viral generations for you to generate that asymptomatic mutant is lower. And the fewer generations you have, the more likely the death toll would be to be catastrophic if there are multiple points of entry across the world. Now, if you just have one outbreak, like let's say that Ebola, for some magical reason, let's say God reaches his hand down or something, or the God, cosmic force, and Ebola is only able to spread from person to person on there, and you can't take it through air travel or something. There are no other hot spots that crop up. It just radiates out from one central point. The chances are very high that an asymptomatic mutant would be generated. You'd have a huge number of viral generations in order for it to have infected a considerable portion of the world. Now let's say, though, that Ebola is capable of spreading in the way that it is, on a ship, on a plane, contaminated cargo, whatever. Now you have 30 or 40 different hotspots around the world. Each one of those hotspots doesn't have to go through nearly as many viral generations, several orders of magnitude less, in order for the whole world to have been infected. There's less of a chance that any individual radiation point will cause that asymptomatic mutation, because you get fewer generations that you need to go through. That's the worst case scenario. Well, now it's in another country already. Who wants to make an over-under about how many countries it has to infect before the world takes it seriously? It's got to be like 4 or 5, apparently. You know, it had to hit the third nation of I think the first one was Liberia, second was Guinea, if I remember correctly. I can't remember exactly what order it went in the West Africa outbreak. It had to go into a third country before people said, oh, maybe we want a response. Shit, and they realized that it was mutation prone, and long before they announced that to the public, and they did it in a very hush-hush manner, you'll remember several years ago, they already were trying to develop vaccines and serums and shit, because it fucking terrified them. The medical community is far more scared about Ebola than you think. You should be a lot more scared of Ebola. Now just think there are other viruses and shit that can do the same thing. Influenza every year, where it's a ticking time bomb for the next Spanish flu to kill 5-10% of the world's population, like it did before. And again, then eventually you get that second mutant, but that we could have hit the lottery. We could have had a 1 in a billion chance during the West Africa outbreak several years ago that asymptomatic variety would even crop up. It could have been a 1 in a billion chance that saved half of humanity. So, yeah, you'll excuse me if I'm chuckling bitterly a little bit at the world medical community for apparently either being too inept to respond. I mean, I understand it's a civil war zone. There are complications you didn't have in, like, Liberia or something like that, over in Freetown. I understand that. But either too inept, unable to respond, or just lacks the will to do so. I suppose. I guess they don't really care if a bunch of people in the Congo die, so to speak, because they have that globalistic mentality that the little people are basically just grains of sand in a vast ocean of dunes for them to exploit. But the same thing can infect them as well. Ultimately, it doesn't matter if you're a billionaire if you get Ebola. You might have quicker access to a serum or something, but those are all experimental. You can die too. It wouldn't be pretty. What happens if rabies ever goes airborne? Well, I guess most of humanity, I guess there wouldn't be a whole lot of humans left. The next generation of humans would be very, very small indeed. I think it'd take us back to the Stone Age, to tell the truth. That's about all. Peace out.